Welcome to this journey through one of the most unsettling cases in Arkansas history. Please let me know where you're watching from and when you first heard this story in the comments section before we start. We want to know where these recorded accounts come from and what time of day or night they arrive. The Hollowoods case of 1907 remains one of the most baffling mysteries in Arkansas history. It starts with a straightforward fact. On October 12, 1907, the whole Hollowoods Caldwell family, a timber community tucked away in the Ozark Mountains, disappeared without a trace. If it weren't for the livestock, 3 horses and 7 hens discovered dead in their cages from apparent malnutrition rather than injuries, their absence would have gone unreported for weeks. What made this case particularly unnerving wasn't only the disappearance itself, but rather what was left behind. The Caldwell Mansion, a magnificent 2-story timber residence built by Thomas Caldwell himself, stood unlocked with dinner plates still laid on. The table. A pot of stew remained half-consumed. Beds were made. The book of Revelation was accessible in the family Bible. Most frightening of all was the parlor mirror, which had been neatly covered with a black cloth, a practice traditionally reserved for when death visited a household. County records reveal the family consisted of Thomas Caldwell, 42, his wife Margaret, 38, and Thomas's brother Edwin, 39. The 3 had migrated to Arkansas from Pennsylvania in 1901, obtaining 80 acres of highly forested land from the railroad business. By all accounts, they came from nearby homesteads and were kind yet reticent. Thomas had a modest lumber mill that supplied neighboring communities with lumber. Margaret was well known for her tinctures and herbal treatments. Edwin, who was listed as a bachelor invalid on tax records, hardly ever left the property lines. The investigation that followed their disappearance was beset by contradictions, erroneous leads, and what some would later characterize as willful obstruction. This is the account of that investigation, the hypotheses it produced, and the shadow it continues to cast on Carroll County to this day. A shadow that spans decades of quiet, murmurs, and terrified looks whenever Caldwell's name is spoken in some Ozarks corners. The site where Hollowoods previously stood has long since been reclaimed by forest. No markers indicate where the Caldwell home stood. There are no memorials honoring the events that took place there. According to reports, the county papers pertaining to the case were kept in the courthouse basement until 1952, when water wrecked countless documents. The oral histories of individuals who lived nearby, a few personal letters, and sporadic newspaper accounts are all that are left. Stories whispered in low tones around winter fireplaces. Stories that typically begin with a warning. Some realities are better left buried in the thick woods of Arkansas. The Caldwell family had made a name for themselves in the rural community as respectable, if rather withdrawn, individuals before they vanished. The description of Thomas Caldwell. In a 1905 business directory as diligent and of solid character. The tiny lumber firm he owned employed 3 local men on a seasonal basis. Ledgers discovered in his office showed that the company was not particularly successful, although it was somewhat profitable. The homestead itself sat over 3 miles from the nearest neighbor, the Patterson farm, accessible only by a narrow dirt road that became practically impassable after heavy rains. Although this seclusion was common for the area at the time, other reports indicate. More than anyone, the Caldwells cherished their solitude. Margaret Caldwell made monthly journeys into the next town, Beville, for supplies, and to offer her herbal medicines which were apparently in high demand for various maladies. She never lingered for social gatherings. Of the 3, Edwin Caldwell is still the most mysterious. According to his records, county physician Dr. R. James Merritt made 2 trips to the Caldwell Ranch in 1904 to treat Edwin, who had what was only characterized as a mental ailment, as a result of combat experiences. Edwin, having served briefly in the Spanish-American War, and, according to Thomas's correspondence with an old business associate in Pennsylvania, had returned transformed in spirit and constitution. It was never made clear what this change actually meant. Their nearest neighbors, the Patterson family, subsequently claimed that they had observed oddities at the Caldwell farm in the months preceding the abduction. The patriarch of the family, Samuel Patterson, described hearing mechanical sounds like metal against metal coming from the direction of the Caldwell area at night on at least 3 occasions throughout the summer of 1907. Margaret had ceased bringing her usual herbal treatments when she visited, according to his wife Eleanor, who said that Margaret had devoted her garden to a specific purpose. Perhaps most telling was an incident described by Robert Finch, a traveling salesman who visited the Caldwell farm around 2 weeks before the family vanished. In a declaration provided to the county sheriff, Finch remembers being greeted at the door by Thomas, who appeared unshaven and distracted. Previously, Finch had been let inside when he visited every 3 months, but this time Thomas did business on the porch. Finch claimed to have heard a low, steady humming noise coming from inside the house. When he inquired about it, Thomas abruptly stopped their discussion, stating only, "We've found something in the woods, Mr. Finch, something that changes everything." The Caldwell family's daily routines had been developed throughout their 6 years in Arkansas. Thomas usually got up early to start his work at his little sawmill. Margaret tended to her huge herb garden and prepared the family's meals. Edwin, despite his health, kept the household accounts with painstaking precision. They lived their lives according to the normal cycles of country life until something threw them off. In a letter dated August 24th, Margaret wrote to her sister in Ohio. Thomas had started spending a lot of time investigating a stretch of their estate known locally as the Narrows, a deep canyon that cut through the eastern part of their farm, in 1907, one of the family's final known correspondences. Margaret's letter claimed that Thomas had uncovered something of significance, but provided no details, indicating only that he had sworn her to secrecy until he could verify certain facts. When paired with an entry in Thomas's business, this letter becomes even more significant. Ledger from September 3, 1907. Indefinite suspension of mill operations. Every resource is devoted to the excavation effort. No more explanation was supplied, but the 3 seasonal workers employed by Thomas said they were paid in full and told their services would not be needed for the foreseeable future. Days before their disappearance was uncovered, on October 9, 1907, the last recorded encounter with the Caldwells took place. Jeremiah Ellis, the postal carrier who serviced the rural routes, brought a package to the Caldwell residence. In his statement to investigators, Ellis said that the item was abnormally heavy for its size and contained no return address, simply a postal mark from Washington, D.C. Margaret, who took the delivery, was uncommonly agitated and asked Ellis if he had noticed anyone following him on his route. When Ellis responded in the negative, she nodded and stated, "They'll come soon enough, but we'll be ready." Ellis was the last known person to see any member of the Caldwell family living. It is unknown what happened in the 3 days that passed between Ellis's visit and the family's disappearance. There were no storm reports in the region that would have required evacuation. There were no documented family emergencies that could account for the abrupt departure. The Caldwells just departed, leaving behind practically everything they possessed, including things of substantial value, such as Margaret's silver hairbrush set, a gift from her father, which was found on her dressing table. The finding of the Caldwells' departure occurred on October 17, 1907, when Samuel Patterson, worried by the odd silence from the next property, went over to investigate. Finding the abandoned house and deceased livestock, Patterson quickly returned home and dispatched his eldest son to Bouville to tell the authorities. Sheriff William Hargrove arrived the following morning with 2 deputies. Beyond what Patterson had already noticed, their first search of the property turned up a number of oddities. According to his formal report, Grove stated that while the residence displayed no traces of conflict or violence, there were hints of quick departure. On a hanger by the door hung a woman's scarf. A pipe, likely Thomas's, sat still packed with tobacco on his desk. Most odd was a sequence of marks found carved into the wooden floor of the kitchen, symbols that Hargrove characterized as unlike any alphabet or numerical system known to me. The celling door was found locked, and when forced open revealed an area converted from its initial intent. The food storage shelves were shoved up against one wall after being cleared out. A big table occupied the center of the room, covered with papers bearing more of the bizarre symbols found in the kitchen. What Hargrove described as a cylindrical, roughly 3-foot-tall brass and copper device with multiple dials and a cranking mechanism stood in one corner. Its purpose was unknown to anyone in the room. The lumber mill was included in the search because it appeared to have been converted to another purpose. The saw blades had been removed from their brackets, and numerous metal parts appeared to have been recycled. One corner had been equipped with a blacksmith's forge, an unusual innovation for tiny lumber enterprises. Most significantly, a complex system of belts and gears had been added to the mill's water wheel to create a contraption resembling the one in the cellar. It was at this moment that the investigation took its first odd turn. According to Deputy Michael Collins, personal. While the property was still being searched, Sheriff Hargrove received a visitor who presented himself as James Colton from the Department of the Interior, according to a journal discovered among his belongings after his death in 1946. No formal record of this visit exists in the sheriff's report, but Collins described Colton as a skinny man of middle years, dressed too well for our country surroundings, who talked with authority and produced papers that seemed to please the sheriff totally. After Colton's arrival, the emphasis of the inquiry underwent a significant change. Instead of pursuing the missing family, Hargrove gave his men instructions to gather all documents, notebooks, and odd gadgets discovered in the mill and cellar. By dusk, the government agent had left the site with almost all of the tangible evidence after loading these things into Colton's wagon. 3 days later, the formal investigation was concluded, and the Caldwell family was noted in the county records as the sole, assumed to have voluntarily left their property for an undisclosed reason. No further action was taken by local authorities. This might have remained the official narrative had it not been for a discovery discovered the following spring by a local hunter, Elias Thornton. While tracking deer in a remote section of what had been the Caldwell property, Thornton came upon a small clearing that showed signs of recent excavation. There was what he called a perfect circle of scorched soil in the middle of this area. It was about 15 feet in circumference, and nothing grew there. Surrounding this circle were more of the weird symbols, this time carved into the trunks of the encircling trees. Thornton reported his discovery to Sheriff Hargrove, who allegedly advised him to avoid the former Caldwell land and to forget what he had witnessed. Thornton's version, which was published in the Berryville Gazette years later, states that Hargrove seemed alarmed by the information and stated that government personnel had told him to inform them personally of any discoveries pertaining to the Caldwell case, eschewing standard protocols. Since later searchers were unable to locate the clearing Thornton found, many people rejected his story as a fabrication. His assertion is supported by the fact that his description of the odd symbols matched those in Hargrove's original report, which had not been made public. For nearly 50 years, the Caldwell disappearance remained a subject of local conjecture, but no formal investigation. The property was subsequently repossessed by the county for unpaid taxes and sold to a forestry business which harvested the valuable hardwoods but never developed the area. The mill and house were destroyed by the weather and scavengers. By the 1940s, little remained to suggest that the Caldwells had ever resided there at all. The enigma started to be incorporated into local legend. On moonless nights, there were rumors of weird lights visible over the former Caldwell property. Hunters reported disorientation when traveling through specific wooded areas, stating that timepieces would malfunction and compasses would whirl pointlessly. Some spoke of hearing voices carried by the wind, whispering in what was described as a language that sounds almost like English, but isn't. If these stories weren't so explicit and consistent across decades, they might be written off as ordinary rural superstition. Additionally, they are remarkably comparable to the occurrences that the Pattersons and other neighbors before the Caldwells vanished, indicating either the longevity of whatever unusual circumstances initially caught Thomas Caldwell's notice in 1907 or a striking continuity in local tradition. Then, in 1956, the case garnered unexpected attention when Professor Harold Jenkins of the University of Arkansas began examining what he dubbed anomalous historical happenings in the Ozark region. Jenkins, a folklore-loving historian, discovered allusions to the Caldwell abduction and started gathering first-hand recollections of the events of 1907 from senior citizens. The story that surfaced was more nuanced than what the official record indicated. In the weeks prior to the family's disappearance, several reports described seeing odd lights in the sky above the Caldwell home. Others recalled anomalous weather patterns, including isolated storms that appeared to be concentrated in the vicinity of the Caldwell property. Jenkins spoke with a number of people about Margaret Caldwell's growing paranoia during her last trips to town, where she bought an unusually large amount of iron nails and salt from the general store. Most significantly, Jenkins unearthed a notebook written by Dr. James Merritt, the county physician who had treated Edwin Caldwell. About 2 weeks prior to the family's disappearance on September 28, 1907, Merritt made the following entry. Called to Caldwell residence questioning E.C.'s condition. Found patient in state of great agitation, claiming to hear. Voices from the hole. T.C. denied permission to see the excavation site, claiming that the issue was within the jurisdiction of the government. Observed odd apparatus in barn. Although T.C. recommended a sedative for E.C. and described it as a receiver for frequencies beyond normal awareness, he doubted that it would be effective against whatever was actually ailing him. This journal entry hints that the excavation effort indicated in Thomas's company ledger had delivered something large enough to cause Edwin serious grief and to merit government investigation. Yet what? It's unclear exactly what was found. A letter, written by Thomas Caldwell to a former co-worker at the Pennsylvania Lumber Company, where he had previously worked, was another fascinating item that Jenkins discovered. A section of the letter, which was dated September 15, 1907, has been extensively examined by people with an interest in the case. What we have discovered is contrary to what is generally accepted. Nothing taught in our universities is comparable to the mathematics involved. Edwin feels we have stumbled onto something ancient beyond accounting. Yet, the precision reflects intelligence rather than natural creation. Metal objects nearby are impacted by the chamber's vibrations. Watches run backward. Compass needles point to the chamber rather than north. I have created a mechanism to measure and perhaps harness these emanations, but I confess I grasp only bits of the principles involved. When I stand inside the circle, I feel as though information is being sent straight to my mind. According to this letter, Thomas, Caldwell had found something that had characteristics that interfered with the regular operation of several tools and instruments. He was trying to investigate these characteristics and potentially make use of them using devices he had built himself. The statement that knowledge was transmitted directly to my mind is especially unsettling since it raises the possibility of either a psychological impact from the phenomenon he was studying, or, more unsettlingly, an outside force influencing his mental processes. Jenkins's investigation resulted in an abrupt end in October 1957 when he suffered what official documents characterize as a brain hemorrhage while working alone in his university office. His notes on the Caldwell case were never recovered despite queries from colleagues. His research was rejected by the university, and the case once more lost public interest. The Caldwell disappearance became one of the local mysteries in the decades that followed. Stories sung over campfires embellished with each recounting, gradually becoming from historical incident to local mythology. The land where the Caldwell home once stood became known as Whisper Hollow, to locals who claimed that on certain nights, particularly when the moon was new, strange sounds could be heard emanating from the depths of the forest. Sounds described variously as mechanical humming, whispered conversations in unknown languages, or the rhythmic turning of great gears beneath the earth. A number of attempts were made by paranormal investigators and amateur historians to identify the location of the Thomas's records mention excavation, but none of them were successful. The terrain had changed dramatically over the decades, with the original landmarks referenced in county surveys long since gone or transformed beyond recognition. The unavailability of credible maps of the original Caldwell property increases the difficulty as the survey documents were among those damaged in the courthouse flooding of 1952. If it weren't for a number of government declassifications, the case might have stayed in the realm of folklore. Papers released in 1967 under the Freedom of Information Act. One of these was an October 12, 1907, brief but important message. The day that the Caldwells are thought to have disappeared. From a man known only as J.C., possibly the James Colton referenced in the Deputy Collins Journal, to the head of the newly established Bureau of Investigation, the FBI's predecessor. The following readable text was included in the substantially redacted memoranda. Situation at Caldwell site contained as instructed. All materials secured. Subjects transported to redacted facility for debriefing regarding the artifact and its attributes. Recommend highest level classified for this matter, as discoveries may have serious implications for national security. Local officials have been told to use a false pretense of voluntary desertion to end the probe. Despite its briefness, this text validates a number of important issues. Government participation in the Caldwell case from the beginning, the presence of an artifact found by the family, and a purposeful endeavor to suppress information about what had occurred. Above all, it implies that the Caldwells were not charged with foul play, but rather placed into government custody, though it is unclear what their final fate was. A second declassified paper, dated November 3, 1907, adds additional context. According to this paper, which was written by a person only known as Scientific Advisor R, preliminary study reveals Caldwell's device functions as described, though his understanding of the principles involved was incomplete. The artifact itself appears to be of manufactured origin, though the materials and methods of construction are inconsistent with current technological capabilities. Carbon dating suggests an age of approximately redacted years, which, if accurate, would place its origin well before known human civilization in North America. Subject T, Caldwell, claims the mathematical principles were revealed to him while in proximity to the artifact recommend. This document raises unsettling questions about the nature of what Thomas Caldwell discovered. The reference to manufactured origin suggests something created rather than naturally occurring. The apparent age places it outside the conventional understanding of North American history, and the most unsettling is the implication that the artifact somehow influenced Caldwell's thought processes. All subjects will continue to be isolated, and the artifact will be transported to a more secure facility for thorough analysis. Though it should be noted that the precise location of the original Caldwell property is now difficult to determine. The land itself has changed hands several times over the decades, eventually becoming part of the Ozark National Forest in 1962. Forest Service personnel have reported no unusual findings in the area, and attempts by researchers and journalists to obtain additional information have consistently been met with denial, or claims that no additional records exist, due to changes in local geography and landmarks. For most of those who study the case today, the central question is not what happened to the Caldwell family. The declassified memorandum suggests they were taken by government agents, but rather what they discovered on their property that warranted such extraordinary measures. The strange devices described in Sheriff Hargrove's report, the symbols found scratched into floors and trees, the excavation site, the artifact mentioned in the memorandum, all point to something well. Over the years, a number of theories have been proposed. Thomas Caldwell, an educated man with a keen interest in geology, may have found an unusual meteorite or mineral deposit with properties that caught the attention of the government. The family may have discovered evidence of past occupants in the area, perhaps ancient structures or artifacts that defied accepted historical understanding, and a more extreme interpretation has gained popularity. The idea that the Caldwells found evidence of non-human intelligence, either ancient or extraterrestrial, is supported by some fringe researchers who believe that the frequencies beyond normal perception mentioned in Dr. Merritt's journal indicate that the Caldwells found something of true archaeological significance. Supporters of this theory point to the strange symbols, the circular clearing discovered by Thornton, and the government's quick intervention and subsequent classification of the matter, dismissed entirely. The Ozark region has a rich indigenous history with evidence of human habitation dating back thousands of years. Could Thomas Caldwell have uncovered some artifact from a previously unknown ancient civilization? One with technological capabilities beyond what conventional archaeology attributes to pre-Columbian North America. Whatever the truth, the Caldwell case stands as a reminder that even in the supposedly well-documented modern era, mysteries remain. Events that slipped through the cracks of official history, leaving behind only fragments and whispers for future generations to interpret. In 1968, an elderly man named Joseph Caldwell arrived in Ville, claiming to be a distant cousin of the vanished family. According to local newspaper accounts, he spent several weeks in the area interviewing older residents and visiting county offices to review what records remained. Before departing, he reportedly told the proprietor of the boarding house where he stayed that he had found what he was looking for, though he declined to elaborate. No record exists of Joseph Caldwell's findings, if any, and attempts to trace him through genealogical records have proven inconclusive. Some speculate he may have been a government agent sent to assess what local memory of the incident remained after 6 decades. Others suggest he might have been seeking information about relatives he genuinely believed had disappeared under mysterious circumstances. One curious detail from Joseph Caldwell's visit reported by the boarding house. In a later interview with a local historian, the proprietor revealed that he was particularly interested in the strange symbols mentioned in case accounts. He allegedly carried a small notebook with similar markings that he compared with those described by locals who remembered the initial investigation. When asked what they meant, he allegedly responded, "They're not a language as we understand it." They're mathematical expressions, equations describing relationships that traditional mathematics couldn't capture in 1907. This statement, if accurately reported, suggests that Joseph Caldwell possessed knowledge about the symbols that went beyond what was publicly available, raising questions about his true identity and connection to the case. The boarding house proprietor also mentioned that Joseph seemed unusually interested in local reports of electronic equipment malfunctioning in certain areas of the forest, asking specifically about anomalous electromagnetic readings, terminology that would have been somewhat specialized for a layperson in 1968. The land where the Caldwell home once stood remains undeveloped to this day, a densely wooded area within the national forest. Hikers occasionally report feelings of unease when passing through, though whether this stems from knowledge of the area's history or some more tangible influence is impossible to determine. Park rangers acknowledge the stories but attribute them to the power of suggestion and the natural disorientation that can occur in dense woodland. In 1973, a group of university students camping in the general vicinity reported experiencing strange dreams on 3 consecutive nights. Dreams in which they found themselves wandering through underground chambers marked with symbols similar to those described in the Caldwell case. None of the students had prior knowledge of the story, making this shared experience particularly noteworthy. Upon learning of the historical connection to their campsite, they attempted to locate any unusual. In 2002, an archaeological survey was carried out in the general vicinity as part of a larger study of early 20th century settlements in the Ozarks, and the team reported finding fragments of period-appropriate ceramics and metalwork, along with scattered foundation stones consistent with the Caldwell home's dimensions, as described in county records. They noted no anomalous findings, though their survey was not specifically focused on the mystery surrounding the family's disappearance. One member of the team, however, later reported in an unofficial capacity that their electronic equipment, including GPS devices and digital cameras, experienced unexpected failures during portions of the survey, particularly in a ravine area that might have corresponded to the narrows mentioned in Margaret Caldwell's letter. This equipment functioned normally when removed from the area, only to malfunction again when brought back. Behavior consistent with strong. The source of electromagnetic interference was not identified. In 1965, a curious side note to the story surfaced when a resident of a Springfield, Missouri, nursing home claimed to be Edwin Caldwell. The elderly man, whose identity was never confirmed, told attendants that he and his family had been taken by government men after his brother had opened a door that should have remained closed. He described years spent in a facility where they asked us questions about what we had heard and seen, but became agitated when pressed for details and eventually refused to discuss the matter further. He died in 1966, taking whatever knowledge he possessed to the grave. Medical records from the nursing home described the man as suffering from persistent auditory hallucinations and paranoid delusions regarding government surveillance. However, a notation in his file indicates that he was able to draw the same strange symbols described in the original Caldwell case, symbols that had never been reproduced in any publicly. The Caldwell case offers a tantalizing blend of documented fact and enduring enigma for those who are interested in historical mysteries. The family's disappearance is a matter of record, and the government's interest, confirmed by declassified documents, suggests something beyond ordinary criminal investigation. However, this curious fact suggests either that he was in fact connected to the Caldwell family or that he had somehow gained access to restricted information about the case. The Ozarks have always been a place where the boundaries between the known and the unknown seem particularly thin, where ancient forests conceal their secrets, where isolation breeds both independence and peculiarity, where stories are passed down from generation to generation, changing subtly with each telling until fact and folklore become indistinguishable, and where the Caldwells were discovered and their ultimate fate remains shrouded in uncertainty. Perhaps this is fitting. Today, those who visit the area where the Caldwell family once lived find only trees, underbrush, and the occasional stone that might once have been part of a foundation or chimney. Whatever was discovered there in 1907, whatever prompted a family to vanish and a government to intervene, has left no visible trace. Only the story remains, preserved in fragments of official record, personal recollection, and persistent rumor. And perhaps on certain nights when the forest falls unnaturally silent, something else remains as well. An echo of whatever strange discovery prompted Thomas Caldwell to write those final cryptic words in his ledger. We stand at the threshold of understanding. God help us if we are right. In the summer of 1963, a geology student named Michael Harden, conducting field research in the Ozarks, reported finding an unusual rock formation in an area believed to be near the former Caldwell property. Harden described a circular arrangement of stones, each marked with symbols similar to those mentioned in Sheriff Hargrove's original report. At the center of the circle was a depression in the ground that Harden first believed to be a sinkhole typical of the area's carved landscape. However, upon closer inspection, Harden discovered that the depression had unusually smooth sides, as if bored rather than eroded, and extended to a depth that his equipment could not measure. Most intriguingly, he reported hearing what he described as mechanical sounds, like clockwork, emanating from deep within the hole. Harden marked the location on his map and planned to return with better equipment. But when he tried to find the site again 3 days later, he was unable to locate it despite extensive searching. Harden's account might be dismissed as the product of overactive imagination were it not for two factors: his academic credentials and reputation for reliability, and the fact that he had no prior knowledge of the Caldwell case when he made his report. He learned of the connection only when his professor, recognizing the similarity to elements of the old mystery, shared what little information was available in university archives. Harden never located the site again, despite several attempts. His experience, documented in a brief article in the Journal of Ozark Studies in 1964, represents one of the few first ear-hand accounts of anomalous findings in the area since the original disappearance. The article attracted little attention at the time of its publication, but has since become a key reference for those interested in the Caldwell mystery. Particularly notable is Harden's detailed explanation of the symbols on the stone circle, each measuring about 3 inches in height and made up of intricate geometric patterns interwoven with what appeared to be mathematical notations, though not any mathematical system I recognized from my studies. The overall effect was one of extraordinary complexity and perfect internal consistency, as if representing some comprehensive theoretical framework. This description bears striking similarities to the symbolism mentioned in Sheriff Harrow's initial report and later by the man in the nursing home who claimed to be Edwin Caldwell, indicating some continuity in whatever phenomenon the Caldwell family experienced in 1907. Journalist Rebecca Turner tried to track down the family after they were removed from the property in 1967, after the government memorandum mentioning the Caldwell case was declassified, and her research turned up documents of a facility known as the Special. Located in a remote part of western Maryland, the research division had been run by the Department of War from 1907 to 1915. The facility was supposedly devoted to the development of communications technology, but Turner found evidence that suggested its true purpose was the study of unconventional scientific discoveries with potential military applications. The facility's personnel records were mostly destroyed in a fire in 1929, but Turner was able to find a former administrative clerk who recalled 3 individuals matching the Caldwell's descriptions being housed there as special consultants rather than as traditional staff. According to this source, who requested anonymity, the 3 lived in a separate building under constant supervision and worked exclusively with a team of government scientists on a project involving sound waves or vibrations of some kind. The source could provide no information on how long the Caldwells remained at the facility or what ultimately became of Despite the documentary evidence of the Special Research Division's existence, government officials denied any knowledge of it, stifling Turner's attempts to follow up on this lead. She later requested information under the Freedom of Information Act, but her requests were denied on the grounds of national security, and she claimed to have been the target of surveillance and covert threats, which ultimately caused her to give up on the investigation. Turner's experience indicates that the government is still sensitive to the Caldwell case even after 6 decades have passed. One aspect of Turner's investigation that has gotten relatively little attention is her finding a death certificate for a Margaret Caldwell dated June 17, 1913 in Montgomery County, Maryland, close to the site of the purported Special Research Division facility. The cause of death was listed as natural causes with no specific ailment indicated. This fact only serves to further enlarge the mystery surrounding what was found in those Arkansas woods in 1907. Age was given as 44 years, which would align with Margaret Caldwell's age at that time. However, no corresponding death certificates for Thomas or Edwin Caldwell have ever been located. If this document does indeed refer to the Margaret Caldwell from Hollow Woods, it suggests that at least she survived for nearly 6 years after the family's disappearance from Arkansas. What became of her husband and brother-in-law remains unknown. The absence of graves or burial records further complicates. The most recent chapter in the Caldwell saga began in 1968, when a package, postmarked from Berryville, Arkansas, arrived at the office of Dr. Elias Montgomery, a physicist at MIT known for his unconventional theories regarding what he called vibrational physics. The package contained only a handwritten note that said, "You might understand what Thomas Caldwell found along with a collection of papers." Montgomery characterized them as both primitive and sophisticated, as if someone with little formal education had been trying to explain quantum-level phenomena using the scientific vocabulary of 1907. The most remarkable was a detailed drawing of a device simply called the receiver, which, based on Montgomery's analysis, appeared to be designed to detect and possibly amplify vibrations existing outside the normal spectrum of human perception. Incorporated principles that would not become part of mainstream physics until decades later, including concepts similar to quantum entanglement and field theory. These papers, which Montgomery later verified as dating from the early 20th century based on the composition of the ink and paper, contained diagrams and equations unlike any conventional scientific notation of the period. Montgomery's attempts to construct a working model based on the diagrams were unsuccessful, as key elements of the design seemed to rely on materials or processes not specified in the documentation. Nevertheless, he became convinced that Thomas Caldwell had somehow developed theoretical frameworks decades ahead of their time, possibly as a result of whatever he had discovered on his property. The physicist published his preliminary analysis in an obscure scientific journal in 1969, but found his academic reputation damaged by what colleagues viewed as an excursion into pseudoscience. The original papers sent to Montgomery were not found among his effects, and his family reported that in his final years he became increasingly paranoid, claiming to be under surveillance and speaking of frequencies that carry messages across time and space. A colleague who visited Montgomery in his final months later wrote that the physicist had begun to experience what he described as auditory phenomena, similar to those reported by Edwin Caldwell, voices that seemed to emanate from nowhere, speaking in what Montgomery described as a language of pure mathematics. Whether these experiences represented genuine perception of some external phenomenon, as Montgomery believed, or were symptoms of mental deterioration remains a matter of speculation. He subsequently withdrew from public life, continuing his research privately until his death in 1975. The Caldwell case intersects with several other mysteries and anomalies reported in the Ozark region over the decades. Local folklore has long included accounts of dead zones where compasses fail and electronic equipment malfunctions, areas where time seems to pass at a different pace, and places where strange sounds, usually characterized as mechanical or rhythmic in nature, can be heard under specific circumstances. Although these kinds of reports are prevalent in many rural areas with robust oral traditions, the fact that these accounts have been consistent across generations and that they resemble phenomena allegedly connected to the Caldwell case suggested that there may be some underlying reality to the folklore. Could these stories be encounters with the same phenomenon that the Caldwell family discovered and attempted to study? And if so, what exactly is that phenomenon? Is it possible that Thomas Caldwell, a man with no formal scientific training, stumbled upon some natural phenomenon that granted him insights into physics that were decades ahead of his time? Did the strange symbols found at the property represent an attempt to transcribe information received through this phenomenon? And if so, what was the source of this information, and why did it prompt such decisive government intervention? These questions remain unanswered and perhaps unanswerable. What can be said with certainty is that in the autumn of 1907, something occurred at a remote homestead in the Arkansas Ozarks. Something significant enough to cause 3 people to vanish from history and to generate ripples of consequence that continue to be felt more than half a century later. For those who have studied the case most closely, a particular detail often stands out. Margaret Caldwell's question to the postal carrier on that final day. "They'll come soon enough, but we'll be ready." The statement suggests not fear of what the family had discovered, but anticipation, as if whatever forces were at work, the Caldwells had made peace with their role in events. This resignation, or perhaps acceptance, is echoed in the final entry found in Thomas Caldwell's personal journal, recovered from a locked drawer in his desk before being confiscated by the government representative. What we have discovered is beyond our capacity to fully comprehend, yet I am compelled to. Continue. The voices speak of things to come, of knowledge waiting to be found, of doors opening between worlds. I understand now why Edwin hears them more clearly than I. His mind was already altered by his experiences in the war, made receptive to frequencies most cannot perceive. Margaret worries for our safety, but there can be no turning back. We are instruments in something far greater than ourselves. Today, the forests have reclaimed what was once hollow woods. The lumber mill where Thomas Caldwell modified his water he-4. Perhaps it is best that some mysteries remain unsolved. As Thomas Caldwell himself wrote in that final ledger entry, "We stand at the threshold of understanding." The house where a family sat down to a final meal before disappearing into government custody has long since returned to the earth, but the mystery still lingers, a whisper echoing through time, hinting at revelations both profound and disturbing. God help us if we are right. In the dense woods of the Ozarks, where shadows seem deeper than elsewhere, and silence carries its own weight, there are still those who claim to hear strange sounds on windless nights, a mechanical humming like great gears turning slowly beneath the earth, marking the passage of time until some appointed hour arrives. And there are still those who avoid certain remote hollows, where it is said the very air seems to vibrate with unseen energies, where watches stop for no reason, where the needle of a compass spins uselessly, and where the mind perceives patterns at the edge of vision, symbols that seem almost but not quite familiar. Whatever the Caldwells discovered in those woods in 1907, its echoes continue to resonate through the decades. A reminder that even in our mapped and measured world, genuine mysteries remain. Fragments of reality that resist conventional explanation, beckoning the curious toward thresholds perhaps better left uncrossed. For in the end, as Edwin Caldwell reportedly told his physician, a strange postscript to the Caldwell mystery appeared in 1989 when a retired government physicist named Walter Grayson published a memoir titled Special Projects, Reflections on 4 Decades of Classified Research. Although the book mostly focused on his work during the Cold War, a brief passage mentioned earlier projects that had influenced his career choice. Among these was his first assignment as a junior researcher in 1937, cataloging artifacts from what was described only as the Arkansas incident. Grayson wrote, "Among the items was a device of brass and copper construction, similar in some respects to a radio receiver, but incorporating principles I would not encounter again until the development of a quantum field theory in the 1950s. The accompanying documentation, partially in cipher and partially in ordinary English, indicated the technology had been designed to detect and perhaps enhance what were dubbed transdimensional vibrations. The equations that governed its operation were particularly noteworthy. They were constructed from theoretical premises that were unprecedented in the scientific literature of the time, although being mathematically sound. I was told that the gadget and its creator had been taken into government custody around 30 years prior, though no details were given. That fleeting encounter with something so far ahead of its time influenced how much. There is yet more to learn about the basic nature of reality. This phrase, however ambiguous, appears to address the device created by Thomas Caldwell and confiscated by government agents in 1907. If true, it shows that the Caldwell relics remained in government custody well into the 20th century and continued to influence scientific study in ways that have never been publicly acknowledged. Grayson's book garnered little attention outside specialized circles, and he died in 1993 before. He may be interviewed about this intriguing reference by scholars interested in the Caldwell case. Freedom of Information Act efforts have not been successful in locating any of the objects or papers he indicated. Certain features of the Caldwell case have gained new significance, as our knowledge of quantum physics and related topics has grown. There are conceptual parallels between the frequencies beyond human perception and transdimensional vibrations mentioned in several stories and the occurrences described in several interpretations of quantum physics, especially those that deal with parallel universes or numerous dimensions. Could Thomas Caldwell have accidentally discovered a natural phenomenon in the Arkansas woodlands that had repercussions that were only subsequently comprehended by sophisticated physics? What effects might this have on our comprehension of reality itself, if any? These questions remain in the realm of hypothesis. But for those who have examined the Caldwell case in depth, 1. Conclusion appears inescapable. Something extraordinary occurred at Hollywood's in the autumn of 1907. Something that continues to defy conventional explanation, even after more than a century. Maybe the whole tale will come to light as science develops, or as government records are more disclosed. The Caldwell mystery serves as a reminder of how much is still unknown till then, even in a world that we think we have measured and charted completely. Today, for people who travel into the Ozarks, particularly to the distant locations where Hollowoods once stood, a word of caution could be needed. Pay close attention to the forest's quiet. Additionally, keep in mind the Caldwell family's fate and carefully ponder whether some discoveries are better kept undiscovered if you hear an odd mechanical humming or see strange symbols etched into old trees.